のよ。私、もうなんと何もしてない頭も顔も。
We've been in for 8 minutes or something, or 7 minutes, so maybe people will join as we go along. Does anybody mind me recording this? Does anybody object? The only reason is I'm just thinking that I'd like to keep the tradition of taking notes for a meeting. So you never know. Yeah. I mean, there are a few things to discuss, which are procedural or whatever to do with Harry Humanist. So I may as well be writing those things down and keeping them as a note for. Okay, so I'll record. Yes, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. We can't hold an AGM. We should have been holding an AGM this month. So we can't hold elections. At the moment, there's only myself, Charles and Tony on the committee. So we're not technically a proper quorum committee anymore. I don't know if that's the first time in our history. Julie, John, is it?
Probably, yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think I'm officially still secretary until after the AGM. So if you don't have an AGM, it could be stuck for life.
Well, no, I mean, yes. Well, we were having to make special arrangements because there's something going on in the world which we have no control over.
True.
So we will have to wait till later in the year to hold elections. If anybody's coming up on the rails.
Yes, I'm sure the present situation merits suspension of standing orders, doesn't it?
I think so. I feel a bit silly calling myself a chair. I don't know if I should carry on calling myself a chair.
What do you want to call yourself?
I don't know. Just David from Harrow Humanist.
Convener, maybe.
You know, or something. Yeah. So, well, the three of us will just carry on until we can hold proper elections or whatever, and then we may also have a situation where we have to reconsider the form of the committee and the constitution and all those things, but we can leave that till later in the year. Charles, I don't know if you contacted everybody here at this meeting about membership.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I did send a general email round to all the previous paid up members, I think, and I've even tried 1 or 2 lapsed members in the past, but they haven't responded, so unfortunately.
That word lapsed always gives me a little tingle.
Catholic.
Catholic lapsed Catholic. So it means that if people are paying, we've got to supply them with some content, haven't we? So we're going to keep try to do these meetings at least, and possibly other things as well. We'll meet as a 3-person committee and discuss what we can do. See how this one goes as well.
David, I'm still the other person for confirming Charles's transactions on the with the bank.
Okay.
So I'm happy to carry on doing that since it took so long for us to set it up. But
no.
You know,
well, we can.
It would be difficult to get someone else to do it in the meantime, I think.
Meantime, yeah. I think it's quite hard dealing with lots of things with banks, isn't it, at the minute? Possibly. Yeah, we'll leave that till later if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay.
Can you actually do that over the internet? Confirming the thing? Well, you can. Well, that's just as well in the present circumstances, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I've got the PIN Sentry and everything that you need to do it. So yeah.
Yes, I know that is a bugbear for organisations that require 2 signatures. That
I know lots of things.
Very difficult to get internet banking arranged for that situation.
It's affecting very many things, isn't it? I don't know if did you tell me about the? I know it was Eileen. That's right. Eileen mentioned the BBC programme Last Word. Have you ever heard that on Radio 4? It had an obituary of Barbara Smoker.
Yes, I know the programme, but I didn't.
It was on.
Apparently, it's on again tonight
Oh, is it?
at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
So
If
Brian Lampard rang me to tell me that.
Oh, thank you. I'll
Be
look
on
out for that.
Well, you
I'll
can
try
all,
and-
you can always get it on BBC Sounds anyway. That's how I listen to
Yeah.
most of the radio programs. So
Mm.
I like
Yes,
listening
I'd like to hear that.
things.
She had a very interesting life.
Yeah.
Hmm.
She's been around for a very long time, hasn't she? I
Mm.
remember her coming to the college I taught at in the, it would be in the 70s, 80s. She paid a couple of visits, once talking about humanism and once talking about, I think, campaigning against, I think, death penalty or something. I can't remember, but she was involved in lots of things, certainly.
Remember, she came to speak to us about 3 years ago.
Mm.
Mm.
Was that before
Yeah.
you came, Iran? Did you?
No,
Yeah.
no, I wasn't there at the time. I wasn't.
Mm.
Talking about
I had to
talking
miss.
about the capital punishment, wasn't she? And
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, she's been doing that for years, because I think that's what she was talking about when
Mm.
she came to the
Yeah.
college I taught at in the 70s or around about 1980.
She's written a book, a sort of autobiographical book called My God-Forsaken Life,
yes,
which I downloaded. It's quite interesting. It goes through all the different things that all the different causes and campaigns and things that she was involved with. So it's quite interesting.
yeah. She. For those of you who don't know Iran, maybe Gus, I don't know if were you around when. Can you remember Barbara Smoker coming to one of our meetings, Gus?
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Murders.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. The other thing, I think, John, you mentioned also listen to the Michael Sandel Global Philosopher Pandemic Ethics program on Radio 4 as well, which I think is something we could talk about.
Mm.
There was also a Pew poll of Americans discovering about the ethics of frontline care and how do you decide, ethically speaking, who gets treatment if there's a shortage of capacity or facilities or equipment or things like that. The Pew poll, quite interestingly, only posed it as a binary, as a dichotomy between should you take the first person through the door, should you treat the first person regardless of who they are, or should the doctor assess which patient should get the treatment if there's only one ventilator and you have two patients, which one gets it? The Pew poll said in America it divided along religious lines, or non-religious and non-religious lines, roughly speaking, that the non-religious tended to be utilitarian in their choice, which I think is sort of modern medical ethics anyway, where you actually assess the outcomes of treatment and you decide the treatment on that basis rather than giving it to the first person through the door. And the religious tended to think possibly that that's not for medical practitioners to decide, that actually it should be, that's playing God, in other words.
Yes, so that is connected, I think, with the criteria NICE use when they're evaluating new treatments, and it's something to do with, is it quality adjusted life years or some such term, where they're looking at how many years of extra life the treatment's provided, but it's quality adjusted. So if they're sort of vegetable for the rest of their lives, then that's not that doesn't count for much. And what was said by I think it was someone who wasn't a medic. There was something on the Today programme where they were talking to a former cabinet secretary. I think it was Gus O'Donnell, who is involved with some sort of think tank that's looking at these problems, and he said that if they were using the NICE criteria to decide whether to go into lockdown or not, the lockdown would never have happened, because the lives they save for that by that would be more than compensated by the problems caused by the lockdown, economic problems, mental health problems, and so on. And I mean, he wasn't advocating that should have been done, but it was just making the interesting point that by that criteria, it wouldn't have been justified.
The lockdown wouldn't have been.
Yes. I mean, but certainly that I think that very problem or something very similar was also discussed on Sandel's program, wasn't
very
it?
similar, yeah.
Yes.
Well, in the old days when I used to watch MASH on telly, and they were always triaging. I'm sure in a war situation they have to triage about, who's going to die, whatever you do, and who's got a chance of survival and that sort of thing. So I think triaging is a standard practice, actually.
Well, yes, but of course we probably all know that the Harrow and Willesden train crash in the early 50s was the first time triage has been used in this country.
Really?
And yes, and the reason was that the medics who got on the scene the quickest were from the American Air Force, and it was second nature to them because that's what they were doing in Korea. And they reckon if that hadn't happened, more would have died there. It was still the worst peacetime train crash in this country in terms of deaths. But but for these American Air Force medics coming over from Ruislip, I think there would have been even more death because they prioritised the treatment of those who could be saved but needed instant treatment over those that were too far gone, or the sort of walking wounded who could wait.
So I wonder what was the situation before then in civilian situations. There was no triage. It was first come. There must have been some on-the-spot assessment previously, you'd think.
Well, yes, but probably not organised in the way that that these people were trained to organise it, basically.
Well, what about wartime? You think we've just been through a war, Second World War in this country. There must have been others to come.
You'd think so, but you spoke about triaging Korea. That might be where the Americans sort of set up that sort of system. It certainly doesn't seem to have been practiced in any sort of formal way in this country before that train crash. If you look at the sort of memorial mural on the walls of the station. Don't know whether you know that. There's a bus stop more or less outside the station, and there's this mural behind it, painted by local school kids.
Did you say Hillingdon?
No, Harrow and Willesden Station. And that is really about the history of Willesden, but the central focus of it is the train crash. It was done as a sort of memorial to the train crash, and they do actually mention this thing about the first use of triage in this country, or the first formal use of triage in this country.
You haven't had experience of emergency medicine, have you, Julie?
No, not really. not firsthand.
No.
I must say, I'm quite glad that I'm now retired, that this pandemic's occurred, because if I'd still been working, I imagine I would have had to still go to work, because hospital workers, even if they're pathologists, and my kids would have had to have gone to school as children of frontline workers, and Tim probably would, and it just would have been awful. So you know, it's sort of
and do we know
a relief in some ways that that it didn't occur earlier.
Do we have any good knowledge of what's happening at Northwick Park now? Because I get slices of news from Harrow Council.
Right. No, I mean only anecdotal. That they've divided A&E into two. One is the COVID line, and the other is everything else, I think. And friend of a friend had a strangulated hernia, and he was into the green zone and into surgery and out again without ever going into a ward. So they seem to have got it kind of organised to some extent anyway.
Yes.
So well, they're finding fewer people turning up, basically. So you can get treated much more quickly in A&E now than usually.
Well, the COVID hospital, the Nightingale Hospital, is apparently virtually empty in London.
They all
It seems to have been a move that was understandable, but has not proved to be necessary.
Yet.
Well, they may come in useful because they will want to free up the wards and operating theatres and so on that have been put into emergency use as COVID wards. They want to free them up for their normal functions. So they may find these specialist COVID hospitals quite useful in getting back to something resembling normality. I think at the moment they're making considerable use of private hospitals for routine surgery and so on, aren't they?
Yes.
Where they're kept with the way that you know they're setting up NHS clinics at private hospitals.
Yeah.
The NHS you have to pay large amount of rental or something, but that's at least sort of separating out the sort of, well, getting routine surgery going again, well away from the COVID patients.
The other question about is about how we're reacting to the lockdown individually and collectively, which is another interesting ethical question of. Initially, there was panic buying, stockpiling. It was the toilet roll week, wasn't it? It was the first week. And
crazy.
And I'm wondering if because we're now in a situation, aren't we, where lockdown's been 5 weeks or something, and there are kind of rules, aren't there? Even if the rules weren't particularly well spelled out by the government spokespeople, but there are certainly around me. There's been a couple of football matches happened on the local park. My road is a kind of cut through to the shops. And there's quite often groups of people who, you know, there might be 7 or 8. It's mostly young men, actually. I don't know why that it is, hanging about together as if there's nothing happening in the world at all, to change the normal routines and habits. And so the moral question is about policing. That's what I wanted to ask, really. Who has the right to impose lockdown, to police what people are doing, how they're isolating, how they're keeping their distance? All of these kind of questions come up, I think. Does anybody feel they have the right to police? Iran?
This is not just an individual protection. I mean, policing is important to some extent because the effect it might have on the rest of the population. If you have got, and as they have been saying about contact tracing, if it is 1-to-1 and then it stops, that is great. But then what happens when it goes to the larger number of people? Around my area, I mean, I have been doing quite a lot of walking, but by and large, everybody seems to respect social distancing, and there hasn't been any problem as such. Every now and then you see, obviously, families are going together, and that is fine. but there has to be some sorts of protection. But unfortunately, the spin-off from this lockdown is not just the disease itself. It is all the ramification, like people are getting depressed, or they are having, apparently, domestic violence cases have gone up tremendously. So, and how do you manage that? I think that is far more serious in some ways. I mean, I have got a couple of friends, I mean, among my friends, a couple of friends, they have been pretty depressed about it all. So you try to, you know, among your friends to be in touch with them.
Yes.
I don't know what else would one do.
I think that this is the problem with a lot of things. The government, when they imposed these, they thought about the impact on people like them who had the resources to be able to cope with a lockdown. You know, big gardens and lots of places they can get deliveries from and so on. Now, I must admit, I've sort of cheated on the lockdown. I'm currently in High Wycombe, on the outskirts of High Wycombe, with my partner, and came here on, I think, something like the 12th of March, well before the lockdown was imposed. But I saw the writing on the wall, and thought, no, I don't want to be alone in a tiny flat.
I don't think that's breaking any guidelines.
No, that's not.
No, it's not breaking any guidelines, because I was here well before there were any guidelines. But it does mean there's the two of us. We're both more or less self-isolating. I can get out into countryside just by going down a couple of quiet residential roads, not encountering any main roads or any shops or anything like that. So you know, being with my partner, I'm actually eating better than I normally do when I'm cooking for myself. Actually, so
we're all eating more.
So I'm one of the few people who probably think, "Oh, this lockdown's quite a nice thing."
Yeah. You think?
It would have been very different if I'd been at home in Harrow, and I think there are big problems for people who are living in accommodation that's cramped anyway, perhaps with kids at home. Thinking perhaps as single parents, that sort of thing, and it must be really, really problematic for them. It's certainly not the case that we're all in it together. It just emphasises existing social divides.
Yes, it seems to, doesn't it?
Gus, are you doing homeschooling with your kids?
Well, I'm not schooling them. No, they're in secondary now, so they're you know, a lot of what they're doing is beyond me. I can't remember the maths, but I can remember some of the primary stuff, but not a lot of what they're doing now. No, they're getting on reasonably well. They have their lessons are on Google Classroom. They are encouraged to stick to the timetable. So if it was, you know, English in the first period, then they get up and they do English for the first period. Some teachers are more diligent than others about setting the work. But a colleague of mine who has a child about the same age going to a private school was saying that she was having the entire school day via Zoom. And you know, full-on lessons and everything. So that's a very different experience. But I was curious to ask David if he thought that it was his civic duty to. Did he feel that he should pick up the phone about the football match and report it, or would that be?
Well, I know that the
Stasi.
Exactly. Well, this is the question, isn't it? Because if you're talking about internal policing, which is internalizing the police force as an individual, then you are talking about a police state, aren't you? Which is what happened in East Germany, or, you know, behind the Iron Curtain. Also, I know that one of the parks was closed by Harrow Council in Rayners Lane, was it? Behind Rayners Lane? Because I think they, because people were abusing the place, they were having picnics and this was consistently happening.
Yeah, that's kind of collective punishment, isn't it? Because for the people who don't have gardens,
yes,
you know, and as John says, living in small flats, they're really dependent.
Yeah.
In an urban area, they're really dependent on these public parks, and public parks.
I don't think Harrow has had much of that. I think Cannons Park was closed for a couple of days. It may have been over the Easter weekend or a very nice a weekend when it was very nice weather. But that was only a temporary closure. The one that there was quite a lot of publicity about within London was Victoria Park in Hackney, which they did close for some time because basically it's the only park for miles around, and it's a very densely populated area, and people were and of course this then forced people onto the canal towpath, the narrow canal towpath, where there were cyclists, walkers and so on, and so any sort of social distancing there was out of the question. But that's the only place people could go to walk their dogs, and they eventually reopened the park, having installed a sort of one-way system round the paths in the park, so that that people could socially distance.
Like swimming lessons in a swimming pool.
But I think it.
We've got 5 minutes left of the meeting. Would you like to carry on? If you want to you can re-sign in if you like. If we stop in a couple of minutes.
Yes, we can just sign in on the same login, can't we?
You can. You should be able to. Yeah.
I think the social impact of this COVID-19 is going to go on for a long time, because there are obviously, it is not just distancing or people not being able to exercise. There are a lot of people whose income is affected tremendously, even that we have got this payment for whatever they are paying them. But I think the social divide will be much more apparent after this episode is over. And what's going to happen is anybody's guess. I don't know.
Yes,
there's a question about neighbours, isn't there? Because a friend of mine from the tennis club actually had the coronavirus, and her daughter lives in quite a busy street where the next door neighbours had a party.
Yeah.
And she didn't know whether she should report them because they were her next door neighbours. Yeah. And, you know, didn't want to kind of make the situation worse. So there can be personal dilemmas occurring.
On the positive side, I feel something good might come out of it as well, in that people are far more friendly and ready to step in and help each other. I mean, even the park that I walk in, 9 out of 10 times, despite social distancing, people say good morning to each other. You know, it is something very pleasant, but also the neighbors. I mean, we had another case in my area where they were asking for laundry bags. Could you make a laundry bag or several laundry bags? So the people, the care workers or NHS workers could take their uniforms and put them straight away in the washing machine. Something as simple as that. And I think in my area, as I said, something like 300 bags were made for these people. So it's something good will come out of it. But of course, it's the way it is at the moment. And it will go on. It's not going to be just over in next week, by next Thursday, when they say that, because there is also the second wave. All these people who you're not supposed to go out, you're not supposed to do this. What will happen when we all go out? I don't know.